All right, so let's bow our heads for the word of prayer before we get started. Lord, I ask this morning that as Stephanie and I share about what you have been teaching us about the second commandment, that we would be clear and encouraging, and that your words would shine through what we have to share. Amen. So, for those of you who have not been with us, this is our third sermon, but our second commandment that we're on. And we're talking about, as Tiffany pointed out, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. And there's more to that. We're going to be talking about idols today. You might go, okay, what does this have to do with modern life? Hopefully this will become obvious as we go through that. I'm going to finish this verse though. So it says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So we want to remind you where we have been. So when we first introduced the topic of the Ten Commandments, we had already done a 20-week study on it. And we had shared with you just some tidbits out of that. And one of the verses that we shared is Psalms 97:7. And Psalms 97:7 says, "All who worship images are put to shame. Those who boast in idols, worship him, all you gods."
Okay, so on idols, there is a lot of talk about idols in the Bible. What we are mainly going to talk about today is in Daniel 3, if you guys want to turn there with me. But there is idols everywhere. There's idols when the golden calf, and when we were doing the study, we were trying to find how can God help us through with idols. So, give me just a minute, I'll find it here.
So while Stephanie's doing that, I just want to add to that. The previous slide had pointed out what we got out of this verse, which we're going to be talking about in more depth. Yeah, we're going to be talking about idols, but we're going to be talking about how we put our focus on God. Idols take our focus away from God. So that should be a little hint as to where we're going. And as Stephanie pointed out, there are several verses in the Bible that talk about idols. There's several different idols that are even mentioned in the Bible. Some of them are idols made of stone, some of them are idols made of wood, and they're all over the place. And as Stephanie pointed out, there's many stories related to the idol worship that was done. Numbers, where we're discussing in our Bible study, has several examples of how the Israelites went astray because of idols.
So here's one example of how the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego followed God instead of the idols what was around them. Can I get a couple readers to read? Let's go first reader from Daniel 3, 1 through 4.
I got that.
Okay.
Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 70 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had set up. When the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together under the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And those who fall not down and worship shall in the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Keep going.
Let's stop there for a minute. So that is right there an idol Nebuchadnezzar made, and he's commanding everyone there to bow down to him. So I just wanted to bring that point out. And now let's read a little farther down. Let's go down to about 12.
Let me start.
Sure.
There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, if you be ready at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast into the fiery furnace. I missed something. You shall worship the image I made, which I have made. Well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve your gods or thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, full of fury, and in the form of its visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated.
So, as we are going through this, they are staying true to God even when they are commanded to do this. So, if we follow Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's example for us on following idols, and then we can stay true to God and not worship idols, then God can save us through it all.
So one of the other things that Stephanie shared with me is this thought that's up here, and she pointed out when she picked the source. So this is a really good example of how there's idol worship all around these people. And they were commanded to bow down, but they decided to, as Stephanie pointed out, focus on what God commanded instead. And they were saved in this case here. So next we want to focus on how do we focus on God by not having idols in our life? How does this apply? So a lot of us know this story. We've heard this probably many times. How do we apply this to our lives? Because if we just left you just with that story and all you got out of it is don't go bow down to a big image of Nebuchadnezzar, hey, you're probably not going to be tempted by that in the next week or so. I'm not anticipating seeing a giant golden image of Nebuchadnezzar. So you think you might be good and you go off. But we're going to dig a little deeper in here. So we have 4 points that we want to share with you of how not to have idols in your life. And the first one is this. Number 1, you got to know what an idol is. So I want you to think for a moment about when you typically, so those of you who are like real deep, abstract thinkers, don't think too hard on this one. When you typically think about an idol, and I'm going to say you can go ahead and shout out, what do you normally think of when you hear the word idol? Just somebody to shout out. What do you normally think of?
Image.
What?
Image.
An image.
Statue.
Statue.
Things that displace God.
You went too far, Steve.
Okay?
No, we will get to that. Steve's brain goes exactly to what I wanted to point out. There's 2 things to kind of be aware of. There are what most of you said are external objects of worship, and this was something that I, in my study, had found. Hopefully I can reach this out. You know, generally when I think of idols, I think of, a fuzzy little pen, not really a fuzzy little pen, but I tend to think of some kind of image of something, maybe like a lucky rabbit's foot or something that you carry around, God that you can carry in a pocket.
Brooke,
Yes.
a long time ago when Heather was knee-high to a grasshopper, we were walking to church one Sabbath morning, and we were in front of the Catholic Church. And Heather looked, I didn't prompt her anything, but she looked over and pointed and said, idol, Mommy. I thought that was pretty profound considering how young she was.
Yes. So we tend to think of, and I borrowed this little guy. No, this is not an household idol for me, but here it is to represent what we're talking about when we're talking about external idols. We tend to think of something that we can pick up, touch, feel, etc., see. I'm going to share a little story with you before we get to the second piece. So when I was looking up, well, what is an idol? Because that was one of the questions as I was defining, well, what is an idol? I'm sure it's more than what I just said there. And so I ran across a story that this pastor told. And so this pastor, he went to India, and he was going to preach in this very rural community in India. And so he had to take the train to get off the station. He gets off the station, and he has to walk to wherever he's going. And he's walking down this village, and he's looking around, and he keeps seeing these little like huts, little temple things with chicken feathers coming out of it, and little, probably not idols that look like this, but little idols that are in there. And he's looking around, and he's like, wow, they have a lot of idols here. How do these people deal with it? It's everywhere, and chicken feathers are everywhere. They're sacrificing chickens to these little gods. And so he gets to the church, he does his evangelistic series, and he talks to this couple afterwards who had said they'd been to America. And he's like, oh, how did you like it? What did you think about America? And the wife looks at him and she goes, oh, I'm never going back. You guys have too many idols over there. And he looks at her and he's like, what? He's like, you got chickens being slaughtered just down the street from you with chicken feathers coming out. We don't have idols everywhere in America. What she was trying to get at, what she knew and what she understood, was she was seeing what we would call an internal object of worship. Yes, there's lots of things out there and signs out there that, yeah, you could say somebody may worship this sign or that sign or this company or whatever. But what she was seeing is people who were so preoccupied worshiping themselves, she recognized that as idol worship. So to make that a good example here, so here we have what we're going to call our external idol of worship, okay? You can bow down to an object, an actual something, but how many of us actually do this? Probably none of us in this room, okay? But in our culture, we have plenty of other ways that we can bow down and worship things. Perhaps this also doubles as a pen, perhaps I am a fabulous writer, and I have written how many books, or I've written poetry or whatever, and I'm very proud of that. So much so that I'm practically, this is what I spend my time doing. This is what I spend my time, my focus and energy on. I worship my intellect. I worship the fact that I can do these different things. That's what we call an internal object of worship. And I think as a culture, this is where we struggle more. We tend to struggle with the things that are not necessarily right out here in the open, but something about ourselves or something, maybe it's our job. Maybe we spend all our time and energy on our job. Anything that Steve pointed out and went straight to that is taking God's place in our life can become an idol. And I think this is really important for us to understand that. Because if you run around and think, oh, I don't have any idols, so I don't need to worry about the rest of the sermon, great, but I'm betting you most of us, and Stephanie and I came to this conclusion too, have some sort of idols in our lives. Usually internal idols are things that are taking the place of God in our lives. So number one, identify what those idols are, whether they're an actual fuzzy idol like I have here, or whether it's something that you really hold near and dear, that God's maybe trying to get you to say, this is really taking the place of me in your life. The second thing we have here is know God's word. So we're talking about the second commandment. So if you know the second commandment, you're ahead of a lot of people knowing what God has to say on that. But here's several verses that talk about God's word, keeping commandments. Well, hello everybody. As you can see, our first video, we found out afterwards when we were doing the sermon that it blipped off about partway through. So I just want to share with you what you missed. You already saw we were talking about identifying your idols, internal and external objects of worship. And so I want to share with you the other 3 tips that you would have missed out on. So number 1 was identifying your idols. The next tip was to know God's word. Know what God's word says about idols in our lives. Know what it says about loving God and keeping his commandments. We read from John 14:15 that said, if you love me, keep my commandments. We read Daniel 9:4, which Daniel prayed and said, I know, God, that you're near to those who love you and keep your commandments. So part of keeping God's commandments, of course, is to be aware of what he wants from us. And if there's a particular idol in your life, an internal object of worship, as you're calling it, that you find out in the Bible what it has to say about it. Pride's a big one for a lot of people. Find out what the Bible has to say about pride and let God use that to grow you into a better person. The third thing was praying for strength, and I symbolize this with a pair of scissors. So letting God be able to cut those things out of your life that we don't need. And one of the points that I brought out is what we idolize, we will demonize when it fails us, but God never fails us. We see this a lot of times in relationships. Sometimes we idolize another person and we say they can't do no wrong, they can't fail us in any way, and when they do fail us, suddenly they become enemy number 1, and we're just sometimes cutting off relationships prematurely because of that. But God never fails us, and what he wants us to do is to realize that he, in his strength, can take those idols out of our lives. There's a couple of verses in there that we shared as well. So 2 Corinthians 12:10 says, for when we are weak, we are strong. We're going to face persecutions. We're going to have trials. We're going to have all kinds of things in our life. But when we're at our weakest, God is at his strongest with us if we let him do that. And also 2 Timothy 4:2 points out, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. When we take a stand and we're on God's side and we allow God to take out those idols out of our lives, we are at our strongest there. And then finally, at the very end of the commandment, it talks about how God, when we keep that commandment, will have a blessing for our children, many generations down, but there's also a cursing in there. If we don't keep that together, if we don't follow what he says in his word, then we are at risk for sending a message to our family and our friends that God isn't important. But when we put God, place him in our life and allow him to bless our lives, it's kind of like he's repainting our lives. He's taking the pieces of our lives that we let him cut out, and he's making a whole new painting on that. So I hope that you guys have had a chance to gain a blessing from this. I know that I have, Stephanie and I have, as we've done this. But identifying your idols, knowing God's word, praying for the strength to be able to deal with those idols, and then allowing God to bless your lives and allowing him to be the strength in your life so that you can put your focus on God.